Insane true crime. The darkest deadly revenge stories ever told. Hook. What if the darkest secrets of your past came back to haunt you? What if your biggest regret was a moment you could never undo, and the consequences followed you every step of the way? In this chilling true crime tale, the line between guilt and redemption is blurred, and there's no escape from the haunting echoes of betrayal. Stay tuned, because this story doesn't end where you think it will. Will she find peace, or is she doomed to face the darkness forever? Watch until the end to uncover the shocking truth. The air felt thick, like it had weight. Every breath was heavier than the last. The streets were empty, no sounds but the distant hum of city lights. Her footsteps echoed off the walls. Too loud. She could feel the tension tightening in her chest. Each corner she turned seemed to stretch longer, as if the world was closing in. The alley was darker than usual, shadowed by a twisted building that seemed to bend unnaturally. She hesitated. Something was wrong. Her skin prickled, goosebumps rising on her arms. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, but her feet wouldn't obey. She was too close now. The door at the end of the alley, barely visible, seemed to pull her toward it. Her heart hammered in her chest. The door creaked open just slightly, a faint sliver of darkness beckoning her inside. A familiar voice, barely a whisper, echoed from within. "Come in." Her throat tightened. She knew that voice, but it couldn't be, not after all this time. She stepped forward, trembling, every instinct telling her to run. Yet her feet carried her forward. The door groaned, swinging open wider. Inside, the room was cold, unnaturally cold. Her breath formed little clouds in the air. It felt like the room was holding its breath. Then she saw him, his figure, draped in shadows, standing near the far wall. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. A slow smile crept across his face. "Did you think you could escape it?" he asked, his voice low, almost playful. Her pulse spiked. She took a step back, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. Her eyes scanned the room. The walls were covered with photographs, old pictures of her, of them, from a time she thought she'd left behind. Time seemed to stretch, warping the seconds into something thick and suffocating. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. He chuckled softly, a sound that chilled her to the bone. "You made your choices," he said, "and now it's time to pay." A sudden, blinding pain shot through her chest. She gasped, stumbling back, clutching at her side. Blood, warm, sticky, began to pour from the wound. Her breath grew shallow, as though the very air was being sucked away. She collapsed to her knees, her vision blurring. The last thing she saw before everything went black was his face. Still smiling, her body was numb, cold, unfeeling. A hollow emptiness in her chest, where the pain had been. But the silence, it was deafening. Everything around her seemed distant. A ringing sound, like static, buzzed in her ears. Her mind fought to focus, to remember, but it felt like she was sinking, falling into a deep, dark abyss. Was she dead? No, she couldn't be. She could still hear breathing, but it wasn't her own. Slow, steady, heavy. She tried to lift her head to see where it was coming from. The shadows seemed to move, flicker. A figure was kneeling beside her. He was leaning in, his face close enough to feel his breath on her skin. "You're not getting out that easily," he murmured. Her body trembled. The cold wasn't just from the room anymore. It was inside her, freezing her very bones. She could taste metal blood on her tongue. His hand pressed against her chest, hard. He pushed her down, back onto the cold floor. "Do you remember what you did?" he asked. She couldn't respond. Her mind was too foggy, too slow. Images flashed before her eyes. The night, the fire, her brother's face, his screams. Everything coming back. The betrayal, the lie she'd told, the choices that had led her here. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps as she tried to speak. Please, she managed. He didn't move, just stared down at her, his smile never faltering. You made me wait, he said. Wait for you to realize. His fingers tightened around her throat. His grip was like iron, squeezing out the air. Her hands scrabbled at his weakly. She kicked her feet, but there was no strength in her legs. She couldn't breathe. Her vision narrowed to a tiny pinprick of light. His voice was the last thing she heard before the world went black again. Now, you understand. Time felt like it was suspended in that darkness. Her mind screamed for air, for clarity. But everything was a blur, a whirlwind of confusion and pain. Then, a sharp breath. A cold, sudden gasp filled her lungs. Her eyes fluttered open. Her surroundings were still dark, but now there was a flicker of light in the distance. The familiar sting in her chest was gone. The weight, the pressure. She tried to sit up. Her head swam, disoriented. Where was she? How was she still alive? A low, familiar laugh echoed from the shadows. That voice. It chilled her to her very core. You thought you could escape, didn't you? She stiffened, recognizing the cruel undertone. Slowly, she turned her head, struggling to focus on him. He was standing there again, the same twisted smile playing on his lips. How, she gasped, her throat raw from the pressure. You didn't think I would let you off that easy, did you? He replied, his voice dark with amusement. She swallowed hard, trying to push herself to her feet. The room was cold again, but colder now. The smell of metal and decay hung in the air, mixing with the scent of something else, burnt like ash. Her heart pounded in her chest. Her hands shook as they reached for her side, but there was no wound, no blood. She blinked, trying to process what was happening. Her mind flashed back to that night. The fire, the explosion, the scream. Where is she? She demanded, panic creeping into her voice. His eyes glittered with malice. You really think it's that simple? He sneered. She's gone. And you... His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. You've been part of it all along. Her breath caught. The world around her seemed to tilt, shifting, warping, as the truth she'd been running from settled over her like a weight. She tried to step back, but her legs betrayed her, collapsing under the pressure. You think you can escape the truth? He asked, taking a slow step closer. You've been hiding from yourself. The walls around her closed in, tightening, suffocating. She looked at him, fear and realization washing over her. Her whole body trembled, but she couldn't look away. The truth was staring her in the face now, and it was more horrifying than she ever imagined. Her vision blurred, the shadows around her seeming to stretch and distort. The weight of his words was unbearable, sinking into her soul like sharp daggers. You don't remember, do you? His voice was colder now, almost disappointed. She shook her head, desperate for clarity. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice trembling. The man stepped closer, his boots clicking on the floor, each step deliberate. You were there, the night she died. You were part of it all. Her mind reeled, memories flickering like broken glass. Pieces of her past she couldn't quite place, twisted fragments of truth she had buried deep. No, she breathed. I couldn't have. His eyes darkened. You did. And now, you'll pay the price. Her heart raced as she staggered backward, the floor beneath her cold and unforgiving. Her fingers grazed the wall, but it was smooth, too smooth. She couldn't find anything to steady herself. She felt trapped, suffocated by her own guilt, her own confusion. Tell me what happened, she begged, voice cracking. Please. He stepped forward, his shadow looming over her like a vengeful specter. I'll tell you, he said softly, but you may wish you hadn't asked. He knelt down, bringing his face close to hers. "Remember her, the girl you abandoned? The one you left to burn." His words were laced with venom. "She trusted you." Images flashed through her mind, blurry at first, then clearer. A car, a darkened alley, flames licking at the night sky. The face of a woman, her sister, trapped in the inferno, screaming, begging for help. Her own hands holding the match. Her heart froze. She had done it. The truth exploded in her mind like a bomb. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. "No," she gasped, "no. I didn't mean to. You didn't mean to," he mocked, his voice dripping with cruelty. "But you did." His fingers curled under her chin, lifting her face to meet his eyes. "Do you know why I'm here?" he asked. "Why I waited for you?" She stared up at him, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking uncontrollably. "Because you killed her," he said, the words cutting through her like a blade. "Now it's your turn." The coldness in his eyes made her blood run cold. Suddenly, she felt the weight of his hands on her throat once more. A slow, agonizing pressure. Her body went limp. Unable to fight back, her vision flickered, the edges of the room growing dark and distant. She gasped for air, but it never came. The pressure on her throat tightened, squeezing the life out of her. Her hands grasped weakly at his wrists, but they were like iron, unmoving. Each second felt like an eternity. Her mind screamed, desperately clawing at the walls of her own consciousness. Her vision blurred further, the world melting into a haze of black. And then, just as it felt like everything was slipping away, there was a sudden release. She collapsed onto the cold floor, her body trembling, gasping for every breath. The man stood above her, watching with a cold, emotionless stare. For a moment, she could barely comprehend what had happened. The room spun around her. She gasped, pulling air into her lungs, her chest heaving as if it might break. "You're still alive," he said flatly, almost disappointed. She could barely focus on his words, her mind a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. Her throat burned from the pressure, but she fought to speak. Why are you doing this?" she croaked. He knelt down again, his eyes glinting with a dark amusement. "Because," he said, voice low, "it's time you understand the consequences of your actions." Her mind was racing, searching for any last shred of hope. "I didn't," she gasped, her words struggling to form. "You didn't," he interrupted, leaning closer. "You didn't do anything?" He chuckled, the sound dark and hollow. "The truth is, you've been running from it your entire life. The guilt, the betrayal, the part you played in everything." His hand reached down, brushing against her cheek. "You killed her, and you didn't even care." Her head spun with his words, but she couldn't escape them. She couldn't escape the truth. Her sister, her blood, gone, and she had been the one who had let it happen. The realization hit her harder than the blows ever could have. She could barely find the strength to speak. "You thought you could bury it," he said, his voice almost gentle now. "But it always finds its way back." She shuddered, her eyes wide with terror. "Now you'll pay the price," he whispered. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she tried to push herself up, but her body was too weak, too broken. She was trapped. And this time, there would be no escape. Her body trembled as the words sank in, the weight of her guilt crashing over her like an avalanche. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, her chest constricting. The man watched her with cold, calculating eyes, a twisted satisfaction creeping into his features. She could feel the darkness closing in again, suffocating her, choking the air from her lungs. "You were the reason she died," he repeated, his voice almost a whisper now. "You betrayed her. You let her burn." Her hands shook as she clawed at the floor, her fingertips scraping against the cold, unforgiving surface. "Please," her voice cracked. but she had no strength left to beg. "I didn't mean to. I—" The man's face remained emotionless, his eyes never leaving hers. "You didn't mean to," he echoed. "But you still did." Her throat tightened, and for a moment she thought she might suffocate under the weight of his words alone. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the images that flooded her mind. Her sister's face burning, crying, pleading for help. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she knew it meant nothing now. The man didn't respond. There was a heavy silence between them, a thick, suffocating pause. Then slowly he stood, towering over her. "You don't get to say sorry," he said, his voice devoid of mercy. "Not anymore." She tried to push herself up again, but her legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed onto the floor. Her pulse hammered in her ears, each beat of her heart a painful reminder of the life she had destroyed. "You're not getting away this time," he said, his tone final, unyielding. Her eyes darted around the room in desperation, searching for an escape. But there was none. Her hands, weak and trembling, reached out to grasp the edges of the floor, but everything felt distant, slippery, like she was losing her grip on reality itself. "You can't run from what you've done," the man's voice cut through the haze. His footsteps echoed behind her, steady and slow. The air seemed to grow heavier, suffocating her with every passing second. She felt trapped, helpless, a prisoner of her own past. And then she heard something, a soft creak, a door opening somewhere in the darkness. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Could someone be coming to help? But when she turned, all she saw was him, standing there watching her with cold, dead eyes. "No one's coming for you," he said, his voice filled with finality. She couldn't stop herself from trembling. There was no escape. Not now. Not ever. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound deafening in the heavy silence. Her limbs felt like lead, too weak to even crawl, too numb to fight back. The man stood still, his figure casting a long, menacing shadow over her. She wanted to scream, to cry out, but the words stuck in her throat, choked by fear. His presence loomed over her, suffocating her, like an unspoken promise of doom. Her eyes darted to the door again, but it remained as silent as the rest of the room. "No one is coming," he repeated, his voice cold and unwavering. Each word sank deep, tearing away the last remnants of hope inside her. Desperation clawed at her. The room seemed to spin around her, blurring in and out of focus. Her hands reached out, grasping for anything to hold onto, but all she could find was the cold, empty floor beneath her. "You knew," he said quietly, almost contemplative. "You knew the price of your actions. You've just been too afraid to face it." The words twisted like daggers in her gut. Her mind swirled in confusion, fighting to make sense of the nightmare she had found herself in. She had tried to run, tried to hide from what she'd done, but there was nowhere to run anymore. No hiding from the truth. I was scared," she managed to choke out, the confession barely a whisper. "Scared," he repeated, his tone dripping with disdain. "Scared of what? Of the consequences of your betrayal? Of your own guilt?" She trembled, shuddering under the weight of his words, but all she could do was nod, her throat tight, her mind a blur of regret. She couldn't run anymore. Not from him. Not from herself. And then, without warning, he knelt beside her. His cold hand gripped her arm, forcing her to look at him. "You think this is over?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is just the beginning." The air felt even heavier now, more suffocating. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, her breathing shallow. "Tell me," he said, his voice low, menacing, "do you finally understand what you've done?" Tears blurred her vision, but she couldn't stop them from flowing. No escape, no redemption, only the weight of her past, crushing her from all sides. She nodded slowly, her voice barely a whisper. Yes, I understand. A twisted smile spread across his face as he stood, his gaze never leaving hers. You should, he said, because it's time to face the consequences. Her chest tightened as his footsteps faded into the distance, leaving her in the cold, empty room, alone. And she knew, without a doubt, that there was no coming back from this. The silence swallowed her whole, thick and suffocating. Her pulse drummed in her ears, each beat a reminder of everything she had lost, everything she had destroyed. Her body was still trembling, her arms weak as she tried to push herself up again, but the weight of her guilt felt like chains holding her down. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in on her. There was no escape, no redemption, just the lingering, crushing weight of the choices she had made. The footsteps, once distant, now seemed to reverberate in the walls, louder, closer. She froze, her breath caught in her throat as she turned her head toward the source. There was no one there, but the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, as if they were alive. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming for her, something she couldn't outrun. The door. Was it still locked? Her heart thudded as she scrambled toward it, her fingers brushing against the cold metal handle. It was locked. Of course. The panic in her chest grew, a rising tide, swallowing her reason. She had to get out. She had to escape. But there was no escape. Her hands were trembling as they slid along the doorframe, searching for a crack, a weakness. But the door was solid, unyielding. She sank to the floor again, her legs giving out beneath her. It was pointless. The weight of his words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, you can't escape. Not from what you've done. Asterisk. Tears blurred her vision as she clutched her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth in the dark. The beginning, he had said. Her heart skipped a beat. A noise, soft but unmistakable, came from behind her. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned her head. There, in the shadowed corner of the room, a figure was emerging, a figure she knew all too well, her sister. Her face was pale, hollow, the flames of the past still clinging to her skin, her eyes empty, vacant. No, this couldn't be real. Her sister had died. She had been the one to leave her to die. And yet, there she stood, alive, or at least something resembling her. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Her body was stiff, unnatural, like a broken doll. The terror in her chest constricted, suffocating her as the figure took a slow step forward. Her mind screamed for her to run, to flee from the horror unfolding before her. But her legs wouldn't move. The figure's eyes locked onto hers, unblinking. And then, without a word, her sister's lips parted, whispering the words that tore through her like a knife. You left me to burn. Her breath caught in her throat. The world around her started to spin. Her sister's cold, dead gaze burned into her soul. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The room was closing in on her once more. And this time, she knew there would be no escape. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, burning flesh, and something metallic, like blood. The walls seemed to close in tighter around her, their suffocating presence pressing against her chest. Her heart pounded, each beat reverberating in her ears. It was all too much, too real, and yet she couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure in front of her. Her sister stood there, eyes wide with accusation, her face hollow and distorted, as if the flames that had taken her life had left their mark forever. The words hung in the air, sharp and piercing. Asterisk, you left me to burn. Asterisk. Her chest tightened, every breath a struggle against the crushing guilt. I didn't mean it, she whispered, her voice hoarse and trembling. I never meant to. I didn't know what to do. But the figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It just stood there watching her, the silence between them growing louder with every passing second. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she reached for her sister, desperate to touch her, to make her understand. But as her fingers grazed the air, the figure seemed to dissipate like smoke, vanishing before her eyes. Her heart stuttered in her chest. Panic gripped her throat. No, no, please. She scrambled to her feet, looking around frantically. But there was no sign of her sister. No trace of the ghostly figure that had haunted her. And yet the guilt remained, the weight on her chest, heavy, unrelenting. She staggered back toward the door, hands frantically trying to open it, to break free. But it was still locked. Her hands banged against the metal, her mind racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be something she could do to fix this. The room felt smaller now, claustrophobic. The air was too thick, too suffocating. The voice echoed again, low and mocking. You can't escape. Not from what you've done. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the cold floor, tears streaming down her face. Her mind spun, racing through the memories, the betrayal, the fire, the moment she had left her sister behind, the screams that still echoed in her ears, the final moments of her sister's life, pleading for mercy. Her heart shattered at the words. She could feel the cold grip of regret tightening around her throat. She had done this. She had chosen this. The guilt was her prison now, and it would never let her go. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she couldn't cry anymore. Not for herself, not for the years lost. She had caused the end, and now in the desolate, empty place she found herself, she knew that the punishment wouldn't be swift. It wouldn't be easy. It would be eternal. The ground trembled once more. The whispering voice, now louder than ever, filled her ears. You'll never be free of me. You'll never be free of what you've done. She bowed her head, tears streaming down her face. She had already lost. And in this moment, she realized there was no escape. Her fate was sealed, the world around her darkened. The once empty expanse now filled with the oppressive weight of 1,000 lost memories. The silence hung heavy, broken only by the relentless sound of her own heartbeat, thumping painfully in her chest. Her body trembled, her fingers digging into the scorched earth beneath her. She had hoped desperately that somehow this nightmare would end, but deep down, she knew it was never going to stop. The voice was still there, lingering in the air, curling around her like a serpent. You can't outrun it, it whispered again, cold and mocking. The darkness inside you will always find you. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, but she refused to look up. The shame was too much. Every ounce of her body screamed to escape, to run, but there was nowhere left to go. She had already fled from the truth, from the guilt, from the past that she had never truly faced. Now it had caught up with her, like a trap sprung too late. You didn't even fight for her, the voice pressed, accusing. You let her burn. Her stomach churned. Every word hit its mark, each one a dagger twisting into her gut. She clenched her fists so tightly, her nails digging into her palms, but it didn't matter. Nothing would stop the memories from flooding in. The fire, the smoke, her sister's face, distorted by pain and fear, the desperation in her eyes, pleading for help. And yet, she had turned away, had abandoned her. She felt the weight of it all, every mistake, every choice, pressing against her chest like an unbearable burden. There was no excuse, no justification. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words barely audible. She didn't know who she was speaking to, her sister, herself, the cruel voice in the darkness. I'm so sorry. And then, in the stillness, there was a shift. A subtle change in the air, a flicker of light in the distance. She felt it. Hope, a small but fragile thing, a crack in the suffocating darkness. Could it be real? Could there be a way out of this prison she had built for herself? For the first time in what felt like forever, she dared to look up. The light grew brighter, pulling her in, inch by inch. But before she could take a step forward, the voice returned, louder than ever. "Run if you want," it hissed. "But you'll always be here, in this place, in your own hell." The light flickered again, and for a heartbeat, she considered the choice before her. The endless darkness, or the fragile chance for redemption. With one last breath, she stepped toward the light, the weight of her sins still heavy on her shoulders. But this time, she was ready to face what she had done, to face the consequences. And with every step, the shadows receded. Just a little, the light grew brighter as she took another tentative step forward, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and hope. The weight of her guilt, the years of running, still clung to her like a second skin. But this time, she didn't want to flee. She didn't want to hide anymore. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she chose to face the truth. Her eyes adjusted to the light, and she saw it clearly now. A path, a narrow but clear way leading through the darkness. The path wasn't easy. The ground was rough, jagged, as if it too had been scarred by the weight of what had happened. But there was something different here, something alive, something real. She walked forward, the air around her growing warmer, the tension in her chest loosening with every step. Each breath came more easily now, as though the weight she had carried for so long was slowly lifting. The voice, harsh, condemning, faded into the distance. Its echoes grew weaker, more distant, until it was nothing but a murmur, lost in the air behind her. She had no illusions that the road ahead would be easy. The past would always be a part of her, woven into the fabric of who she was. The guilt would never fully disappear, but with each step, she was letting go just a little. Letting go of the shame, of the anger, of the regret. Her sister's face, once filled with pain, appeared in her mind again, but this time it wasn't a memory that crushed her. It was a reminder of the love they had shared, the bond that had never truly broken, even in death. She could hear her sister's voice, soft and forgiving, whispering to her through the darkness, "You didn't abandon me." The words hung in the air, echoing in her heart. For the first time, she felt like she could breathe. The path before her stretched on, but now it was more than just a road. It was a chance for redemption, for healing. And with that, she stepped into the light, leaving the past behind, knowing that the journey had only just begun. But this time, she wasn't alone. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Please forgive me. Please, I didn't mean for any of this to happen." But there was no one to hear, no one to answer, just the silence, the haunting silence. And in that silence, she realized the truth. There was no forgiveness. Not now, not ever. The door creaked. Just the slightest sound. But it was enough to make her heart stop. Slowly, she turned her head toward it. The door was opening. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light. She didn't need to see his face to know who it was. It was him, the man who had brought her here, the man who had orchestrated everything. His cold eyes locked onto hers, and a sick smile spread across his face. "You're not done yet," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Her heart clenched, and she took a step back, shaking her head. No, please. I've faced it. I've faced everything. Let me go. Please." But he took a slow, deliberate step forward, his presence overwhelming. "You haven't faced it all," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Not yet." The room felt colder. The walls seemed to close in tighter. And then she realized the truth. He wasn't the one in control. He was just the messenger. It was her. She had always been the one holding the keys to her fate. But now, she had nothing left. The man stepped closer, his hand outstretched, and as he reached for her, she knew there was no way out, no redemption, no escape. And as his fingers grazed her skin, everything went dark. The darkness enveloped her entirely, swallowing her whole. There was no sound, no light, only the cold, suffocating void. Her body felt weightless, drifting. Her mind was spinning, spiraling into nothingness. It was like floating in an endless ocean, where time didn't exist, where she could lose herself forever. But even in the deep, endless blackness, she could still feel it. The weight of everything she had done. The guilt, the fear, the memories that haunted her every waking moment. Her breath caught in her throat as she felt something, a presence, cold and sharp, just beyond her reach. She couldn't see it, but she could sense it. A figure, watching. Her pulse quickened, her skin crawling as the sensation of being trapped deepened. The void around her seemed to close in, pressing tighter with each passing second. "You thought you could run," a voice said, low and familiar. Her heart stopped. She knew that voice. She had heard it in the darkness before. The man. "You can't hide from the truth forever," he whispered. "You can't escape your fate." Her mind screamed, her body trying to fight against the oppressive darkness. She wanted to wake up, to tear herself free from this nightmare, but it was like the very air around her had turned to stone, holding her in place. "Please," she gasped, her voice shaking with the remnants of fear. "I don't deserve this. I don't deserve it." "You already know the answer," he replied, his voice colder than ice. "You deserve everything that's coming, everything you've earned." Tears welled in her eyes as she felt a sharp pain, like a cold hand around her heart, squeezing the life out of her. The memory of her sister's face, twisted in anguish, flashed before her. The fire, the screams, the betrayal. "You left me to burn," the voice echoed, repeating her sister's words, relentless, unyielding. Her chest tightened as the truth crushed her, the weight of her sins pressing down, suffocating her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she knew the words meant nothing now. There was no redemption, no forgiveness. "Sorry isn't enough," the man's voice whispered in the darkness, his presence closing in. "Not for what you've done, not for the life you've taken." Her body trembled, but she couldn't move, couldn't escape the grip of guilt that had been growing inside her all these years. And then, through the suffocating void, there was a shift. A strange pressure, like something had broken open within her, filling the emptiness with a raw, unrelenting sensation. Her eyes shot open. Light, bright, blinding light. She gasped, her body jerking as the sudden shock of reality hit her like a jolt of electricity. But something was wrong. The air was too thin, too cold. She looked around, confused. She was no longer in the dark space. She was standing, though she didn't know how. The world around her was desolate, barren, covered in ash. Her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps, but she couldn't control it. She couldn't breathe right. She turned, frantically searching for an escape, but all she saw was a stretch of blackened ground, scorched and burned. And then she saw it, her sister. But this time, there was no twisted face, no hollow eyes, only the same figure that had haunted her dreams, standing there, like a shadow of the past. "You're still running," the figure said, its voice familiar, like the echoes of a forgotten memory. She stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. "I can't, please." But the figure stepped forward, its form melting into the shadows. "You can never outrun what you've done," it whispered. "Not when the darkness is inside you." Her heart thundered in her chest, her legs shaking as she tried to move. She couldn't escape. Not from this, not from her own mind. The figure vanished into the darkness. And then, just as she thought the world might swallow her whole, everything went silent. The crushing weight lifted. For the first time in a long time, She could breathe, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was empty, hollow. The stillness hung heavy around her, oppressive, as if the world itself had stopped moving. She stood in the barren landscape, the ground beneath her cracked and scarred, the remnants of something long dead. Her chest still ached, a dull throb that reminded her of everything she had lost, everything she had done. A voice broke the silence, but it wasn't the one she had expected. This one was soft, almost soothing. "Do you think it's over?" She spun around, her heart racing. The air around her was still, yet the voice seemed to come from all directions. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of what she had seen, what she had done. "I can't take any more of this." The voice laughed, but there was no joy in it, only a hollow, bitter sound that made her skin crawl. "Do you really think you can escape this?" it asked, growing louder, more insistent. "This punishment? The consequences?" She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block it out, but the voice pushed through, relentless. "You're guilty," it said, each word hammering against her skull. "You always will be. No matter how far you run, you will never escape it." She staggered backward, her legs giving way beneath her. "I'm sorry," she cried out, her voice raw, desperate. "I didn't mean to." "Doesn't matter," the voice cut through her, sharp and final. "You did." The ground beneath her trembled, and she felt it, like a pulse, vibrating through her body. The air grew heavier, the temperature dropping, like something ancient and cold was awakening. She looked around frantically. There was no way out, no place to run. Her knees hit the scorched earth, and she curled into herself, the weight of everything bearing down on her. Her sister's face flashed in her mind again, and she squeezed her eyes shut to try and block it out. But the face lingered, haunting her. "You left me," the voice whispered. "You killed me."